Welcome to this UK LFI Charitable Trust webinar on a new report from the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation, addressing the EU's policy to Israel and the Palestinians. This report, posing the question, two states for two peoples, and subtitled The Palestinian-Israeli Conflict, International Law and EU Policy, addresses the origins of a failed policy of two states for two peoples and how international law has been invoked to justify it. Now, it's unfortunate that adherence to this misguided policy, as the report argues, has caused the EU to ignore underlying realities, undermine Israel's sovereignty, and remain unresponsive to changing dynamics in the Middle East, in particular political and economic conditions. Now, the report addresses the assumptions underpinning this policy over the past 4 decades, since its inception in the Venice Declaration in 1980, explaining why each of these assumptions is incorrect, and it makes recommendations for reforming EU policy accordingly. I'd be grateful, ladies and gentlemen, if you could put your questions into the Q&A facility for the discussion after our initial presentations. And I'm delighted to introduce our panelists. Professor Wolfgang Bock, a specialist in law and political science, has held posts at the University of Marburg and the Justus Liebig University, Gießen. He writes on, amongst other things, constitutional law, security law, and policies and legal cultures in the Middle East and North Africa region. He served as Counselor for Constitutional and International Law at the Federal Academy for Security Policy, an institution of the German government, and he's also been a judge at the Frankfurt-Main Regional Court and the Wiesbaden Administrative Court. Andrew Tucker co-founded the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation, or thinc. It's a non-profit think tank which advises politicians and policymakers on the proper application of international law in relation to the Israel-Palestinian conflict and the Middle East generally. He previously worked as a senior fellow in the Faculty of Law in the University of Melbourne. He was in-house counsel to the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission and a research fellow at the TMC ASA Institute for European Law, International Law, and International Commercial Arbitration in The Hague. Joining us from The Hague, it's a pleasure to have you both with us, gentlemen. Andrew, I'd be incredibly grateful if you were to give us an overview of your report recently published. Andrew, you on?
It would help if I unmute myself. Natasha, thank you so much for this invitation, Jonathan, Carolyn, and UK Lawyers for Israel. We've known each other for a while, and in fact, when thinc started the Hague Initiative, we kicked off with a conference in the Peace Palace in 2017 that you were present at. So I remember that very well. thinc is an independent research institute dedicated to trying to understand the application of international law to this conflict, particularly in the Middle East generally, because we feel that politics and law are incredibly mixed up, and it's helpful and important to have some sound legal analysis. This study that we carried out over the last 2 years and published at the end of last year is about the European two-state policy. Since 2000, and in fact, since 1980, really, with the Venice Declaration, the European Economic Community and more recently, the European Union has held a very strongly worded policy, which is repeated time and again in Council conclusions of meetings and other publications. Lasting peace, says Europe, must be achieved through the establishment based on a negotiated peace agreement of an independent, democratic, contiguous, sovereign, and viable state of Palestine living side by side with Israel in mutual recognition. That's the official EU policy. And it sounds very nice, and it's a very nice ideal to have, the idea of two states, two peoples living peacefully side by side. Let's take it apart. There are 3 aspects of this policy. 1, the political view that two adjacent states is the only way to resolve the conflict, and that resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is necessary to achieve peace in the Middle East. That's a political view that Europe takes. That's one. Secondly, this policy is backed up by so-called legal parameters. The European Union uses legal language strongly to support its policy. And thirdly, it implements its policies and parameters in concrete projects and programs. It puts a lot of money into this project, which will be discussed a little bit later. Now, in 2020, 2 years ago, when we started this project, why did we do that? Because there's a complete stalemate. There is no independent, viable, sovereign Palestinian state. There are no negotiations to speak of. What do we see? We see a state of Israel. It was created in 1948. Palestinian state was not created in 1948. It could have been, but was not. We have a Palestinian Liberation Organization established in 1964. Its charter was amended in 1968. It is still dedicated to the liberation of the whole of Palestine, which means the destruction of the state of Israel. This was confirmed in the recent International Criminal Court proceedings, with a very helpful submission by Professor Benvenisti of Cambridge University. We have the Oslo Accords, which are confusing and very unclear on the ground. The West Bank is divided into areas A, B, and C. The status of Jerusalem is unclear. We have a Palestinian Authority, which is corrupt and non-democratic. Radicalization in Palestinian territories, failed negotiations. Many times there have been many efforts to reach a permanent status settlement that have failed. And in 2011, the Palestinians openly went to the international tribunals to internationalize and legalize the conflict. And we've seen a strong move towards the right in Israeli politics. We see that in the current government. So the purpose of this study was to pull all of this apart, not to challenge the idea of two states as such, but to challenge the assumption that a Palestinian state is both legally necessary and practically viable. We do not advance a one-state solution or any other solution. We do not advocate unilateral action by either side. But we do question the assumptions. We studied four things in the report. Firstly, the historical background to the conflict. Secondly, the development of the European policy in the critical years, 1967 to 1980. These were the years really that the policy was established after the Six-Day War, and particularly the Yom Kippur War in 73. And we did a study of France, Germany, the UK, and the Netherlands to understand how those countries moved from the position expressed, for example, in Resolution 242 to a position where they advance Palestinian statehood. Thirdly, we looked at the legal positions adopted by Europe. And fourth, we looked at the realities on the ground. And very, very briefly, and Professor Bock will go into much more detail than I, but our key findings on those points, firstly, the conflict. The conflict has been going ever since the fall of the Ottoman Empire. It's an existential conflict, not a territorial conflict. Secondly, the European policies established in those critical decades after the Six-Day War were really formed to appease the Arab interests and remove the Arab oil boycott and get rid of Arab-sponsored terrorism. Europe was politically and economically motivated in supporting the Palestinian case. The legal parameters were developed to support this political view. Those arguments were developed later, and we go into the different legal political models that there are for understanding this conflict. And Europe adopts one of those models, a very specific one. It's called the occupation, no sovereignty model. Europe says Israel is an occupant. It's an occupying power in the territories outside the Green Line. Therefore, it has no territorial sovereignty. Now, that's a very strong legal claim that we investigate, and we come to the conclusion that it's not It does not represent international law. In fact, it's a biased view which is not applied to any other conflict, let alone any other occupation situation. And we look fourthly at the realities on the ground, the realities of this policy as it's expressed in the projects and programs that Europe sponsors, finances, carries out on the ground. And we come to a series of conclusions and recommendations. So we hope it's not the final answer, but we hope it's a study which will provoke discussion and help perhaps clarify a framework for discussion. One of the things that is missing in all of this, there's a lot of rhetoric out in the debate, but very little sound legal reasoning. And that's our hope, that this, not that the law will solve the conflict, but without strong and sound legal reasoning, there will be no sound resolution to the conflict. Thank you so much.
Well, Andrew, thank you ever so much, both of you, for publishing this report. I think it's doing exactly as you intended, not least with this webinar and the discussion that will follow, but also with the follow-up conference in the spring. And I look forward to the issues in this book perhaps being raised directly with the EU officials responsible for continuing this foreign policy. Professor Bock, I know that you're going to speak to some of the underlying legal issues. May I hand over to you for those aspects of the report? You are on mute. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm the first time here, and from what I saw and heard, I think the more the better. I present the essential results of our study in 8 points. What are the basic elements of the Palestinian political culture? All Palestinian political institutions and organizations see the conflict between them and Israel as an existential and not a territorial one. The polls since around 1990 show a clear majority wants the destruction of Israel and even expects it within 1 or 2 decades. The Palestinian conservative Islamic society and culture is tribal, family and clan orientated. Under these conditions, the conflict is seen as a question of honor. Offering money or economic development can't change this. The Palestinian majority sees a state only as a further step in the lethal fight against Israel. Second point, what are the structures and the driving factors within the political culture of the Middle East and North Africa region? To get hegemonic power for her Shia theocratic dictatorship, Iran undermines with her proxies, mostly terrorist groups or militias, in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, states, and strives for the nuclear bomb. Extremist Sunni groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, supported by Turkey and Qatar, try to take over states by elections, or like IS, Al-Qaeda, or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, to conquer them by force. Against this camp of extremist Islamist orientation stands a group of states with conservative political programs enabling political and economic progress, sometimes very slow. Israel, Egypt, and the other Gulf states, and Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, Sudan, and Morocco. The Abraham Accords, aiming at normalization and closer ties with Israel, show the slow political road for progress. A groundbreaking political change will become possible if the Iranian theocracy collapses. Jordan must be kept, otherwise an Islamist Jordan would bring hell into the region. Third point, since the Venice Declaration in 1980, the EU has a clear political position towards the Palestinian-Israeli conflict: build a Palestinian state in the West Bank. The 2 most important examples of this policy are financing the Palestinian Authority and other Palestinian institutions with between 700,000 million and 1 billion per year, plus around 500,000 million euro from the member states. Second example, building illegally in Area C. Area C, a big part of the West Bank, stands according to the Oslo Accords under Israeli administration. Up to 28,000 buildings were constructed between 2012 and 2018 to prepare the way for Palestinian statehood. Point 4. The EU propagates 3 international law positions. The first one, Israel has no sovereignty over East Jerusalem and the West Bank. The second, Israel occupies the West Bank and East Jerusalem and must leave them. Third position, the Palestinians have a right to statehood in these places. Our results show that these are no legitimate claims under the perspective of international law. Regarding the mandate of the League of Nations from 1922, granting the Jews a national home in Palestine. Regarding the legal valid foundation of only one state in the mandate territory in 1948, namely of Israel. Regarding the international law principle of uti iure possidetis, meaning the borders existing in 1948 became the legal valid borders of Israel, the borders of the mandate territory, including the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. And regarding the fact that Israel won back legally the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip in the defensive war of 1967 from the illegal occupiers, Jordan and Egypt. Regarding all this, there's only one legal consequence. Israel has better rights of sovereignty in all these territories than all other contenders. Fact is, Israel wants negotiations to resolve the conflict, but the Palestinians declined them, decided to fight the existence of Israel, and decided never to recognize Israel as a state because they want to fight them. The result is neither the first nor the second legal position of the EU have standing. There is no occupation, as there is no other state with the right of sovereignty in these territories. Israel applies all humanitarian rules of the Fourth Geneva Convention, controlled by the Supreme Court of Israel, though it is not legally bound by the convention. Is there a Palestinian right of statehood, as the EU pretends? The Palestinians can claim legally the right of self-determination, but this right implies only a right of autonomy, not of statehood. A Palestinian statehood could only become possible via negotiations with Israel. But nobody will invite a man who declares he will rob you to become his neighbor. In 7 points, six points, what should the EU do? The main principle, get rid of the whole failure of building a Palestinian state. First, further genuine Palestinian acceptance of the Jewish people as a nation and of the state of Israel. Second, de-radicalize Palestinian culture, society, and leadership. Third, no more money for the overly corrupt Palestinian political institutions and organizations and the radicalized parts of the Palestinian political culture, including pay for slay. We can talk about this in the discussion. Support the Oslo Accords in Area C and stop illegal building there. 5, support Israel's rights in the West Bank pending an agreement. 6, recognize Israeli sovereignty over East Jerusalem. We come further to the results that Israel may insist politically and legally on a form of Palestinian autonomy instead of statehood. Vis-à-vis the many extremist dangers and developments in the region, Israel may insist on secure borders controlled by herself. That was already the result of the UN Security Council Resolution 242 in 1967. They said that was a necessary condition of peace. The last point, which is especially hurtful to the EU, further financial help of the EU must be conditioned on real steps towards the rule of law, towards equal rights of citizenship and human rights for everybody, including Jews, on normalization with Israel along the Abraham Accords, and last not least, on effective public, accountable and audited parliamentary oversight regarding the spending and the effects of spent money. And I'm glad I still have time to go to some difficult points. One very difficult point is that the EU all the time doesn't control where the money goes. And they say that it's important that they don't do it because it's such a difficult political situation. That was the answer to the chamber which controls the finances in 2014, when they found out that in the Gaza Strip, the EU paid hundreds of people for doing nothing, paying their rents, paying their salaries. They did nothing. The answer was that is a very political, difficult question. We will do it further. So you see, the EU has some internal tasks to do. But in the end, I want to explain you what is one of the largest and biggest difficulties. This difficulty is the EU thinks the Palestinians want a modern Western style, democracy, rule of law, centralized monopoly force of the state, working police. To give one example, they give quite a lot of money to train the police, and they want a police law valid for the whole West Bank. There has never been produced such a police law because the Palestinians think and see that if somebody has the complete power on the police, he may make himself leader of the state rather soon. They have 6 security organizations which are divided and which can be brought into position against another. That means different people can look that they stay in power. And if there would be one police structured by one police law and one director, one president of the police, that would be seen as dangerous. In the same way, democracy is seen as dangerous because in a society where you have tribal clans, families who struggle against another and try to come to an equilibrium. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. In such a society, if somebody gets elected democratically to the complete power of the state, he'll work in favor of his clan, of his family, of his tribe, and exclude the other ones. Therefore, democracy in such a society doesn't work from alone. So such a society has to restructure itself by open discussion with democratic freedoms to look which way they want to go. That's not possible in the West Bank or in Gaza at the moment. They are dictatorial entities. And to open this way to further development of the Palestinian culture, one has to do quite a lot. The EU does nothing. The EU closes her eyes and says, well, there are some problems. These problems are there all the time, but the EU doesn't do anything to get rid of these problems, and they don't want even to bring in the middle of the discussion the human rights violations in the West Bank, which are horrendous, from the Palestinian Authority, which the EU finances. So you see, the EU doesn't want this discussion because there are so many bad sides of her policy that, it becomes difficult if it is in the open. And for example, the pay for slay question, there are laws bringing huge pensions to people who are being imprisoned in Israel because they tried to kill, or they succeeded in killing Israelis. if you are being condemned to 10 years, you have afterwards the right to be a public servant in the Palestinian Authority. That stands in the law. And the family gets all the time quite a lot of money if you have tried or if you have succeeded in killing an Israeli. That's open, in the open, but most people here in Europe don't know about this because it is seldom published and it's not being debated. We should open the room for debate. That's the aim of our study. Thank you for letting me present you some parts of it.
Professor Bock, it's I who should be thanking you. And in fact, we recently here in the UK in the Jewish Chronicle had a series of in-depth articles assessing the human rights abuses under the Palestinian Authority that were amongst the issues that you've highlighted. So increasingly, there is a light being shone over those activities and that suffering. I'm extremely grateful for your overview of a lot of the legal aspects of this report. Perhaps I might just summarize the assumptions that you point out that underpin the EU's policy. The first, of course, is this conceptual assumption that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is territorial and not existential. The second is the legal assumption that the West Bank belongs legally to the Palestinian Arabs. And the third is this practical assumption that a peacefully democratic, fully fledged Palestinian state is feasible. And it's clear, I think, that there is a lot of work that needs to be done, which isn't being factored into this process. May I ask, with respect to your conclusions, first off, and then there are a lot of questions that have been flooding in, which I'll turn to in short order. Amongst your conclusions, you lament the irony that the manipulation of international law to serve what you describe as EU energy, security and foreign policy interests in the 20th century that has carried through and has resulted in the obfuscation and obstruction of those interests in the 21st century. And you include, of course, also that rather than achieving peace, this approach continues to feed hostilities and to undermine also the legitimacy of international legal authority through the misapplication of law that you've described. But Professor Bock, could I begin by asking you just to flesh out how it is that you say these current policy interests have been frustrated or obfuscated or obstructed by that policy from the 1980s?
Yes, you see, in the 1980s, they thought they would appease to the Arab and Palestinian wishes and policy by going their way. And they tried to do this. And so all the time they supported the Palestinian Arab perspective by giving them money, by giving them legal arguments, and being engaged, really personally engaged. Hundreds of people from the Foreign Office in Berlin, I know, are very engaged in favor of the Palestinian side and engaged against Israel. And that is only possible if you look away from the international law questions and the real questions which are being posed. Who has the claim of sovereignty over the West Bank? And what about the mandate? What about 1948? And what about the Euro uti possidetis? These questions are not discussed. You know, I asked the foreign ministry in Germany around 2014 if they had any legal analysis of international law on these positions. I got the answer, you know, we all the time relate to international law, and that's quite clear what our position is. I didn't get an answer. And so that's how they work, how they try to work. And therefore it's necessary to go to the legal foundations. And the legal foundations say the right to self-determination doesn't give the right to statehood. Quite clear. And so the right to statehood has to be negotiated. But of course, as long as the Palestinian culture is as it is, Israel would be very stupid to let a Palestinian state come into existence, because it's used as a further platform of war against Israel. So, and the eyes are being closed against the extremism of Palestinian culture. And the best example, what really astonished me, was the speech of Abbas in the European Parliament in 2016, where he spoke about Israelis poisoning Palestinian wells. That's one of the oldest libels, more than 1,000 years old, of anti-Semitism and modern anti-Israelism. When he spoke it out, I would have expected at least few people, 2 or 3, to have the civil courage to stand up and to say, we leave you, we never listen to somebody who is so anti-Semitic as you are. Nobody did that. What about civil courage? John F. Kennedy wrote a book on this, and I didn't see any sign of civil courage within the European Parliament at that time. And one has to change this, and one has to encourage people to stand up and to say the truth. That's why we did our study, and that's why it's so necessary to look very clear and very close at the Palestinian situation. There are few Palestinians who do say what the reality is, but mostly they live in Israel. They don't go into the West Bank any longer because they are being threatened. There are very few people who can say this, but we pay quite a lot for the universities, for example. The Europeans pay quite a lot for the universities, where not a free discussion on all these problems is possible. Yeah.
Well, I hope the discussion will be prompted by the contents of your report more broadly. Andrew, may I ask you, one of the issues that the study examines is how, and also to what extent the EU seems to rely so heavily on international law to justify the positions it's adopted. And we've already heard that this is a misapplication of international law, but nonetheless, the law is being cited rather than just politics. Have you been able to glean why you think that is, why international law is being deployed so forcefully in this context and for this purpose? You're on mute, I'm afraid. Yes.
A very good question, and we do try to dig into that issue, Natasha. There's a couple of things. One is the Europeans, after the Six-Day War, okay, so you had the 6 European states in the economic community who were still recovering from the Second World War. It's only 2 decades since the war. Germany and France in particular trying to get onto their feet and to re-establish a European identity. And it was the Cold War. And I think one of the things that was happening over that period was the European 6, then joined in 1973 by Great Britain, Ireland and Denmark, were to create this concept of a European entity that has its own legal culture. Very much at the heart of European identity is the idea of a legal a body which is based on law and which wants to export its concept of the rule of law to the rest of the world. So I think that's at the heart of it. But secondly, what happened also was within Israel, there was a tremendous debate going on about how to handle these territories. And you basically had 2 kind of lines of thinking. One of the lines of thinking, which we think actually most accurately reflects international law, as Professor Bock has explained, that Israel's position territorially and as a matter of sovereignty, as a matter of statehood, and the position of the Arab states and the Palestinian people, on the one side is to say that Israel has stronger rights in a very complex area of law, but clearly Israel took those territories in a defensive war. It had the right to keep them, and based on the mandate, it had strong territorial claims, and the Palestinians didn't have a right, at that point anyway, perhaps certainly not to statehood. So that was, but on the other side, you had a very strong voice within Israel saying, no, these are occupied territories. The only way to resolve this dispute is to separate ourselves from the Palestinians. And in order to do so and to protect Zionism, we have to treat the territories as occupied. That was the advice of Theodor Miron to the foreign ministry at the time, his advice, which later became public. And this line of thinking even today is very strong in Israel, that the territories are occupied and therefore Israel has no sovereignty, was a view that was propagated from within Israel very strongly. And I think these two elements came together, as it were, and reinforced the European view, which adopted that second view that I've just described, as opposed to the first view, so you had these driving forces both within Europe and within Israel itself.
Andrew, thank you. We've had a number of people asking where they can get their hands on this report, and I'm glad to say that there are links in the chat as opposed to the Q&A facility, which was where I'm drawing the next questions from, but you can find links in the chat in order to obtain that report, and it will be sent out after this email also. Forgive me, after the webinar via email. There are so many questions that have been prompted by your discussion so far as to, what is the possible solution then? If not two states, what on earth do we advocate for? And I'll just pick out a couple of them, if I may, because some questioners have posited alternative suggestions, and I'd love to canvass your views on them. One questioner writes, what about 3 states for 2 people? One that is Israel, another in Gaza, in confederation with Egypt, for 25 years, the questioner specifies, a third in area A and B in confederation with Jordan for 25 years also. So that's one scenario, perhaps the 3-state scenario involving Jordan and Egypt. Another questioner asks whether Jordan is in fact a Palestinian state and why it is not presented as the Palestinian state. Wolfgang, could I ask you to take either of those or both of them as you see fit? Yes. In the first instance?
The idea is fine, but the actors won't agree to such a solution. The Egyptians don't want radical Palestinians in addition to their, and especially as the Hamas is a sister organization of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood belongs to the fiercest hostile groups in Egypt who fight against al-Sisi. And al-Sisi and the majority of the Egyptian population defeated the Muslim Brotherhood in 2013 with huge demonstrations and a military coup, which found a really big support in the population. So they don't want Hamas governed Gaza Strip to become part of Egypt or in a confederation. It's much more difficult with Jordan. Jordan has a majority, a majority, one can say, of Palestinians within their population who went there in different times. However, they have the king there, and the king is being stabilized by the Bedouins, by the tribes, and no Jordan, even if he is Palestinian, will forget 1971 when Arafat came to Jordan and tried to make a coup d'etat and take out the king. And there were about 15 or 20,000 Palestinians killed in the ensuing military fights. And so the king of Jordan and the Jordanians don't want radicalized Palestinians in a great number to come. So it's all these solutions may only be solutions is a question of autonomy, for example, in area A and B, can only be brought to a good development as far as there is not more terrorism emanating from these territories. The more radical the Palestinians are, the more terrorism is being brought out from there, financed by Iran and by other people, the more difficult will any solution become. Because what can you do with a terrorist enclave fighting another state? Is there any possible solution? The only possible solution is learning that this radical policy has been defeated. And if they go on in radicalizing and terrorizing, the state of Israel will have to decide if they go in and take out many of the terrorists. It's just the same with Gaza. It's not as bad as in Gaza in the West Bank, because Abbas is being threatened by Hamas in the West Bank, and he wants Israel to help him against the more terrorist Hamas. That's the reason why the security cooperation works with the Israelis. So you see, as long as you have a small evil terrorist danger and a bigger terrorist danger, the development won't go well. So we need pressure onto the Palestinian culture. And this pressure can only come from other Arab states, therefore the Abraham Accords, and that they say, we don't want you to be so radical and to terrorize Israel, and from the Europeans as well, who are the most spending people in the world regarding Palestine. Most of the money going to Palestine, and Palestine gets more money than every other development country, country of development aid. Palestinians get more than every other country besides some small South Sea islands. They get more because they have fewer people and they have bigger problems.
By which you mean the Palestinian Authority and Hamas in Gaza?
Palestinian Authority, Hamas doesn't get as much as the Palestinian Authority.
Okay. Yeah. It strikes me from what you're saying that the key factor here is time. It reminds me of the story of the Israelites leaving Egypt in the Bible, led by Moses. It took them 40 years to cross the desert into the land of milk and honey. And the only convincing explanation I've heard for that amount of time to be needed to make that journey is that the Israelites left Egypt a generation of slaves, and in order for them to become a free people, that generation needed to change, and a new generation needed to be able to grow up with the education away from bondage and educated with what we would probably think of today as Western liberal democratic values, to the extent that they were applicable at the time. And so long as the incitement to the issues that you've described, the terrorism and the funding of that continues, that time that's needed is perhaps being pushed further and further away.
Yes.
Andrew, what do you say to the questioners, multiple, who've asked, your analysis holds out virtually no prospect for peace. Does this mean that there's essentially no policy that Israel can pursue to achieve a lasting settlement? What would your, and I say you are on mute at the moment, but are you able to give any comfort to these questioners?
Well, I don't think it follows from our analysis that there's no prospect for peace at all. I think you could look at the situation in Israel itself is one way of looking at it. Okay, so Israel was created in a conflict situation to be a state, a Jewish state for all the people of the territory. That's in the Declaration of Independence. And you know, we see it on a daily basis. One of the struggles day by day in Israel is how to manage this country, which is, you know, populated and owned by a great multiplicity of ethnicities and religions. Yes, a majority of Jews, but a strong Arab minorities of many different ethnic backgrounds. And it's not easy, but, you know, they do a pretty good job. And sometimes it goes better and sometimes it goes worse. But there's a model there to work towards, I think, which holds out a prospect for peace. I think, secondly, a lot of Palestinians genuinely want to live in peace. The polls show indeed a kind of a desire not to live in peace. But, you know, if you break it down, I think you take a lot of the politics out of it, and perhaps some of the religion as well, then most people simply want to live a pretty straightforward kind of existence. I was speaking this morning to a very intelligent, articulate young Palestinian woman from Bethlehem who now no longer lives there. But her work is about working together to build relationships. And I think part of the problem is we think very much in a top-down Western kind of way of models to solve the problem. Whereas I think at the end of the day, and it's not unique to Israel and the Palestinians, we see it throughout the Middle East, is probably how do you deal with a multiplicity of ethnic groups living often merged with each other with very unclear territorial boundaries? How do you create a culture of coexistence? And we're dealing, unfortunately, with the Palestinian territories with 5 decades of a very, unfortunately, Western-funded radical education system, largely in the UNRWA camps, where they've been educated to hate Jews. But if you take that away, the Palestinian people and the Jewish people, and they have for decades and for millennia lived side by side. You know, when the Jews went for the 40 years from Egypt into the Promised Land, yes, there was some fighting going on, but at the end of the day, they had to live with the people in the land. And it's the same today. The Palestinians are not going anywhere. They're not going to be driven to the other side of the Jordan. The Jews are not going anywhere. And they're the only ones at the end of the day who can live with each other in this tiny little territory. And I think we need to encourage and equip them, and certainly not incentivize them to do otherwise, to develop this culture that Professor Bock talks about, of a culture of coexistence.
Natasha, may I still give one more perspective from your picture? This 40-year picture is very interesting because many of the Palestinians don't come from this territory. About 2/3 of them came from other countries in the Middle East, went there because the Jews prospered and there was economic progress. Therefore, they came. And many of them have relatives in other countries. And as soon as these other countries go against the Palestinian policy fighting Israel, and the people in these other countries do it in the same way, there will be connection between families and relatives who say, shouldn't you change your policy? But you know, the Abraham Accords are only just 2 years old, and many of the governments taking part in the Abraham Accords, for example, the not taking part Saudis, are afraid of their populations because these populations have been radicalized in the same way as the Palestinians are over 40, 50 years by their governments. It was the possibility of getting applause from them. And this radicalized population is still there. So the governments going to the normalization policy and wishing it are afraid of their own population because they are still in this radical, part of them are still in this radical mood. So it really takes, sorry, a longer time till all can develop. I'm sorry, but I don't see fast movements. Of course, if the Palestinians would be defeated decisively and would say we have been defeated, but I don't see the possibility at the moment. this would be easier. You know, the Germans have been defeated, and with good luck they have been defeated, and they could learn from this. And so this learning process was enforced, but had some good results. And the Japanese were in a similar situation. So learning from defeats is sometimes a good political possibility. This possibility doesn't exist in this way in the Palestinian territories, so it takes a longer time.
And inevitably it comes down to education. There are so many questions. I'm going to try and speed through as many of them as possible with quick fire answers, if at all possible. Following on though from Andrew, from what you were just saying, one questioner asks, why does nobody point out that even a so-called two-state solution or better, forgive me, this doesn't entirely make sense, but it will not erase, is what the question is asking, the charter of the PLO, in which a goal is the destruction of Israel. So that goes to the heart of the impasse, it seems, that you've been addressing. May I ask more of a specific point? One questioner raises the term continuous in the EU statement in relation to the proposed Palestinian state, and asks is that of concern? Andrew, how geographically is a proposed state to be continuous, given the geography we're all familiar with?
Contiguous, I think, is the word. So that has to be a I mean, this is an idea that Europe has invented. Okay, so there are examples of states that are not contiguous. It's not easy, but you can have a state where territory is not physically attached to each other. So that's an idea that Europe invented to it's not a legal concept, and I don't know. Obviously, if you want to connect Gaza with the West Bank, you've got to create some kind of connecting construction, whether it be a tunnel or a corridor or something. That can be something to strive towards. And
in the alternative, if we're looking at an autonomy, which it must be said that the Palestinians in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip do essentially already enjoy, that autonomy can be in the separate units.
Yes, and there are different ways of having autonomy. Again, we're coming at all of this very much with a Western mindset. I think all of these terms that we use are Western, and again, the problem of imposing this on a culture and a people and a history that hasn't grown out of that, I think is. So the autonomy has to come from bottom up. It can't be imposed from top down. The Palestinian people, if they want to govern themselves like any people, need to develop their own systems and culture of self-government. And it's not about creating institutions, it's about creating a mindset.
There are a couple of questions. Forgive me, Professor Bock, did you want to come back?
No.
One question which has been burning is, and it's reflected in a couple of the questions that have been posed, what is the reaction been so far? Not least in Germany, in The Hague, what have you sensed in the media perhaps, but also importantly from the EU? Do you have the sense that what you have been writing about is going to be taken seriously? Can it prompt some introspection and some analysis as to the path that has been taken and whether there are revisions required to that going forward?
Well, it's an interesting question because it was taken seriously, our study, but in another way than we had thought. There was a very good article in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, which is one of the main newspapers in Germany, conservative one, liberal conservative, I would say. And this article was being criticized by the redaction and taken out. Though the article was in most parts completely correct, they didn't like it. And the majority of the redaction, it was a feuilleton where it was published. That means not the political part, but the literary and arts part. And the majority of these people thought we don't like it, and so took it out. And that against that came reactions in other newspapers and come reactions. And they criticize this because this has never happened before. Never before in the history of this newspaper and of relevant newspapers, something like this has happened. So we have a big scandal in Germany, and the Israeli ambassador has already written to this newspaper a very ironic letter. And so it's a question of censorship within a redaction amongst people who are working for this newspaper for more than 15 years. So this is really very interesting. You see, this question rises in Germany. Many people to high emotional levels and mountains, and therefore we have a very difficult situation here.
And in academia and in politics, perhaps from the EU itself, have you had any particular reactions?
I'm sure all people in the EU and in the Foreign Office of Germany who see this will say, if we can, we will silence it to death. They don't like it at all. And there are very few people with courage who say one has to discuss it, one has to look at the realities. So, but we hope we can keep the discussion going, and maybe some more people will react, because it's even in the legal, you know, I come from university and I know the colleagues, even in the legal profession, it takes time for these ideas to come through. It's not a self-going process, but it takes much work and time.
Well, I wonder if one of the reasons for the reaction that you've described, not least from the EU, is in relation to, in particular, the description that you gave of 28,000 buildings between 2012 and 2018 in Area C. Now, of course, Area C was agreed by the parties to the Oslo Accords to be entirely within Israeli civil and security jurisdiction until otherwise determined. What would you say are the legal implications of what the EU has been doing, building illegally in this area, as given its own commitment to the Oslo Accords?
They're extremely negative, the legal implications, because yes, you mentioned it, the EU was a witness to the Oslo Accords. They have underwritten it, and they said that is law, and we want to keep it going. And now they act completely against what they have witnessed 20 years, 30 years ago, and they imagine a state would build in England houses in the wood against the law and saying, oh, we need this group to be helped. It's a similar situation there in the Area C. So it's completely illegal, and the EU comes into difficulties as soon as many parliamentarians see what has happened, because it is not only very small newspapers brought reports on these questions in the last years. And as soon as it becomes a bigger question, millions go there, and they are wasted for illegal things. All these constructions have to be destructed by police, military, and so on. It goes to court and so on. And the EU works in a way illegally you can't describe precisely, and that's the point. I think where people, they were convinced that they were acting for the good thing, but now they see everything doesn't develop into the direction they wanted. And so the difficulties become larger. And that's the reason why our study in my view, is so important, and I think there will be many discussions following. They won't be able to stop this completely. It goes on, and we have brought the study in the European Parliament and presented it there in the building, and there were some parliamentarians there, and I'm sure there will be more parliamentarians asking these questions.
Andrew, can I turn to you for a couple of final words on the reception as you've seen it, perhaps from The Hague?
Well, as I think Professor Bock was saying, we've really just started. Mustn't forget that European policy is made, in the capital cities. So it's very important that the discussion takes place within the member states, and that means taking this discussion into the capital cities, and The Hague actually is one of them. So it's not so much the international institutions in The Hague as the Dutch government, and it's there. So this report has started to find its way, but I think it's a very long process. This is going to be step by step to raise issues which have been so deeply embedded in European thinking. The Dutch Prime Minister, he still they keep repeating this mantra of the two-state when they know that it's not working. But hopefully there are some very, very good politicians who are only too keen, I think, to have tools in their hands and arguments in their hands that they can use to raise the issues. And so I'm confident.
And this is one such tool, that the start of, as
you say, it's not perfect, Natasha, by any means, but it's at least it's a start to develop the discussion.
Which is wonderful. I'm only sorry that we haven't been able to get through more of the questions. I would encourage everyone to read the text, and I hope that they'll find that their questions are answered therein. I can actually indicate that in one of the entries just put into the question and answer facility is a report from Rega Veeam dealing with that building in Area C. And the comment that indicates they have documented over 81,000 illegal structures. So even more, I think, than perhaps was readily available from the material that you looked at through the EU. I'm sorry we haven't had more time. I know there will be continuing discussions about this report, and I do encourage everyone to access it and read it and to promote it. I'm incredibly grateful for the time that you have both given us this evening, and I very much look forward to continuing to work on these issues with you. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.